The ballroom glowed in soft amber light, the kind meant to flatter expensive people. I was pinning a crooked name badge onto a board member's tuxedo when I caught the first sideways glance. You know the kind. Tight-lipped, polite, like someone about to complain about the Chardonnay but deciding you weren't worth the breath. That was the third one in 10 minutes. The first came when I'd handed the CFO the corrected compliance addendum, the one he'd botched by citing last year's version. I'd rewritten it backstage in heels sharp enough to be considered a weapon. The second came when the CEO raised his glass for the evening toast, and somehow managed to thank everyone except the person who'd saved his $350 million deal from imploding at customs 12 hours earlier. That person, of course, being me. This was supposed to be the company's victory lap, the annual Vision Gala, the kind of corporate mating ritual that bled money from every pore. Imported seafood towers, champagne from vineyards no one could pronounce, and a jazz band flown in from New Orleans whose smiles were as expensive as their instruments. I'd spent the morning on the phone with the Federal Trade Compliance Office, smoothing over a last-minute clearance issue with the European investment delegation. One wrong phrase, and the deal would have evaporated. But I'd handled it. Quietly, perfectly, invisibly. That's what I did. I erased risk. I made other people look flawless. And yet, that night, something shifted. The air in that gilded room felt heavier, colder. I saw the CFO whisper to HR during dessert. I knew that look. That was the face of a man asking for help ruining someone without leaving fingerprints. HR smiled the way people do when they've already decided which knife to use. The crab claws suddenly tasted like pennies. Around the room, executives fiddled with their cufflinks and badges as though the word compliance had become contagious. I tried to ignore it, smiled for the photographer by the orchid wall. He probably just wanted a candid shot of the woman running the show behind the scenes. But somewhere behind the flash, I heard someone mutter, "She won't need that for LinkedIn much longer." That was the moment I knew. They weren't planning to fire me. No, they'd do something worse. They'd erase me. By midnight, the music had stopped, and the chandeliers reflected in half-empty wine glasses like little gold lies. I stood in the loading dock outside, barefoot, holding my heels, watching an intern puke into a bush between Uber pickups. My toes ached. My chest burned with a strange calm. They didn't know it yet, but they had just pushed a woman with her finger on the detonator out into the night. And I already had the trigger tucked neatly in my purse. The next morning, at 7:14 a.m., the email came. Subject: Quick Sync, HR. No context, no agenda, just the corporate equivalent of a death rattle. I was still peeling the adhesive from my event badge when it buzzed through. 15 years at Colburn Dynamics, and they gave me a calendar ping like I was a borrowed intern. By 9 a.m., I was in conference room 5B. Meredith, the HR director, was already there. Immaculate, pastel suit, sipping a green smoothie like this was a wellness retreat. Next to her sat my former trainee, Jordan, a man whose greatest professional accomplishment was remembering to unmute himself on Zoom. He wouldn't meet my eyes. His leg bounced under the table, the way it used to when he'd ask me for help writing a risk memo. "Thanks for coming in, Aaron," Meredith said, her vowels smooth and weaponized. "We've been evaluating structural alignment across the compliance vertical. It's time for some strategic realignment." There it was, the sanitized execution. She went on, her voice all honey and euphemism. "Effective immediately, your role will transition under the risk division, reporting to Jordan. We see this as an opportunity to streamline decisions and elevate emerging leadership." I stared at her, then at him. Jordan smiled like a kid offered the keys to a Porsche he didn't know how to drive. Meredith handed me a glossy folder labeled New Horizons. I let it fall into my tote with a dull thud. "You okay?" Jordan asked, almost sheepish. "I'm fine," I said evenly. "Just wondering what tie you'll wear when this place catches fire." His smile flickered. Meredith blinked. I stood, smoothed my skirt, and walked out without signing a damn thing. I wasn't angry. Not yet. I was something far more dangerous. Awake. I didn't head straight home. Instead, I stopped by my desk, booted up my personal laptop under the polite fiction of transferring personal files, and began something much quieter and far more devastating. The glossy New Horizons packet sat unopened beside me, cheerful blue fonts promising growth and opportunity. As if being professionally lobotomized could be rebranded as self-care. I opened my private drive, scrolled to a folder marked Contingency, and there it was. The blueprint. I'd built it 4 years ago, after the first wave of executive reshuffles made it clear that loyalty here was a liability. Inside were notes, templates, and one file labeled DSID, Form 14B, my kill switch. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table, still in my work blouse, watching the cursor blink on my resignation letter. I wasn't quitting. I was arming something. The letter itself was short, clinical, legally airtight. No adjectives, no nostalgia, just language sharp enough to draw blood. I didn't even cry. I thought I would, but all I felt was a strange, surgical calm. The house was silent, the kind of silence that hums in your ears after years of background noise. You see, I'd helped design Colburn's pre-acquisition compliance architecture back when the company was courting international capital. It was a Frankenstein's monster of federal filings, regulatory disclosures, and risk harmonization protocols, the kind of dense, bureaucratic jungle no executive ever reads. Buried deep in that system was my creation, the Delayed Separation Impact Declaration, or DSID Clause 14B. On paper, it was a safeguard, a federal compliance trigger designed to prevent last-minute personnel swaps before a deal closed. In practice, it was a tripwire. If a certified officer with clearance was demoted, reassigned, or removed before the ink dried, the clause automatically forced a 90-day freeze and full reapproval of all existing authorizations. The logic was simple: prevent fraud and ensure continuity. But the effect was catastrophic if misused. I'd inserted it years ago as a just-in-case, a self-defense mechanism against exactly what they'd done to me. And now, for the first time, I was going to pull the pin. I opened the secure federal portal, navigated to the Compliance Declarations tab, entered my employee ID, and uploaded the necessary documentation. Under trigger type, I selected structural reassignment impacting regulatory authority. Effective date: today. Supporting documentation: internal realignment memo, role adjustment confirmation. Then I clicked Submit. The timestamp read 11:42 p.m. Eastern. No confirmation fanfare, no flashing lights, just a small pop-up that said, Form 14B filed successfully. Review pending. That was it. One quiet keystroke, and the entire $350 million acquisition had just been placed in legal cryostasis. I didn't even smile. I just closed the laptop, poured myself a glass of water, and sat there in the dark, letting the silence settle like dust. The next morning, I woke before sunrise, showered, dressed, and placed my resignation letter in a draft email, addressed to Mark Sullivan, CFO. CC, HR, Legal. Subject line: Notice of resignation, Aaron Calloway. I didn't send it yet. Let them have a normal morning first. Let the coffee still taste like victory before it curdled. By 9 a.m., the first tremors began. A mandatory risk alignment briefing was added to the calendar, the kind of meeting title that meant panic disguised as professionalism. I wasn't invited, obviously, but they'd forgotten one small thing. I'd built their system. I still had admin access to the internal meeting recordings, so while they gathered in conference room 2A, I sat at home in my robe, sipping bitter French roast out of a mug that said "World's Quietest Threat," and queued up the live feed. The camera flickered on to reveal a dozen anxious faces pretending not to be anxious. Junior execs fidgeted, pretending to understand the slide deck that still bore my formatting, my color scheme, my initials in the watermark. Watching them stumble through my work was like watching toddlers try to drive a Tesla. The new compliance lead, Greg, was sweating through his shirt by slide 3. When the European investor's voice broke through the speaker, calm, accented, lethal, asking, "Excuse me, what is the Callaway schema, and who authored it?" I nearly choked on my coffee. "The, schema?" Greg stammered. "That was Erin's framework. She's currently on extended leave." Extended leave? I almost applauded. The lie was so neat, so corporate, so fragile. The European investor paused long enough for the silence to feel like an autopsy. "Was this schema formally transitioned to her replacement?" he asked, voice cold and precise. "Is there documentation of approval continuity?" Greg looked to the CFO, Mark Sullivan, whose forehead glistened like a man realizing the floor beneath him wasn't marble. It was glass. "We're navigating a minor handoff process," Mark said, tone slick and falsely calm. "Nothing to worry about. The documentation is sound, but the investors weren't buying it." Another voice chimed in from the stateside partners, low and impatient. "Then why are there no clearance sign-offs post-transition?" Greg skipped ahead 3 slides too fast, landing on a flowchart he didn't understand. My flowchart. The one with conditional triggers, hyperlinks, and logic loops coded directly into the template. In the bottom corner, a small note blinked like a warning label. Trigger, eSouls, role reassignment, pre-close. Restart approval cycle. He didn't even see it, but the investors did. Their cameras flickered. Mics muted. Someone exhaled sharply into a headset. The CFO's smirk faltered. I closed the window before it got ugly. I didn't need to watch the implosion in real time. I already knew the sequence. They had demoted the one person whose clearance validated the deal. That single HR realignment had just detonated the compliance bridge holding the entire acquisition together. Now they were standing in midair, pretending gravity was optional. At 8:42 the next morning, while I was buttering burnt toast, my phone started vibrating across the counter like it was alive. Blocked numbers, one after another. I let them ring. When they gave up, a text came in, from Anna, the analyst I'd mentored 2 summers ago. She was one of the few who'd actually read the fine print on anything. "They're panicking. Investors are asking for your signature. CFO looks like he hasn't slept in a week." I stared at the message for a few seconds, then typed back. Not my circus, not my monkeys. No punctuation, no emoji. Just clean detachment. I set the phone face down and poured another cup of coffee. You could almost feel the chaos through the city air. Somewhere in that glass building, Mark was pacing with his tie undone. Jordan was probably trying to explain realignment to a lawyer twice his age, and Meredith, from HR, was perfecting her damage control smile. They had built a machine they couldn't operate. I'd simply removed the instruction manual. Around 10 a.m., another email arrived. Anonymous sender, internal domain. The subject line read, "Urgent authorization review." Attached was a scan of a forged document. My name, my signature. Same Garamond font I'd standardized across every compliance file, except this one used Arial. Rookie mistake. I stared at the forgery for a long moment, then exhaled through a slow laugh. They'd tried to fake my clearance to bypass the 14B freeze. They didn't even get the typography right. I didn't report it. Not yet. I wanted them to sweat. I wanted the weight of silence to press against their lungs until they realized what they'd done. So, instead of forwarding the evidence, I opened the federal compliance portal. Status 14B. Under review. All flags raised. The deal was officially in limbo. That afternoon, I walked downtown past Colburn's headquarters. 18 stories of arrogance and overpriced glass. My old office still glowed behind tinted windows, a ghost light left on for a play that was already over. I felt nothing. No rage, no nostalgia. Just the clean satisfaction of cause meeting consequence. Inside, Mark was probably drafting a damage control memo about unexpected regulatory complexities. Legal would be combing through contracts looking for loopholes. The board would be demanding answers. But the truth was simple. They'd triggered the clause themselves, and no amount of caffeine or corporate spin could unpull that pin. When I reached the corner, my phone buzzed again. Another message from Anna. They're trying to call you into a meeting. Investors want to renegotiate. They said the acquisition's on hold. I typed one line back. Then it's already dead, because deals don't die when papers stop moving. They die when confidence does. And I had just drained theirs dry. Inside Colburn Dynamics, the temperature had shifted from smug confidence to quiet panic. I heard later from a friend in accounting that Mark had convened an emergency boardroom meeting that same afternoon, pretending everything was under control while the Reinhardt Capital delegation, the very Europeans I'd charmed into signing, sat stone-faced across the table. The video feed leaked later through an internal server backup. I didn't need to hack anything. I'd set up the retention settings myself years ago. Watching it back later felt like déjà vu, except this time, I was the ghost in the machine. The boardroom was silent except for the faint hum of air conditioning and the click of someone's pen. Mark sat at the head of the table, sleeves rolled up like a man trying to look busy while his empire crumbled. Reinhardt's senior partner, a tall man with silver hair and a stare sharp enough to cut glass, spoke first. "We're missing a continuity signature," he said, flipping a red-line document. His accent clipped. German precision. "Your own filings list this requirement." Mark's jaw twitched. "We have the paperwork. Aaron, filed everything before her departure." The lawyer beside him cleared his throat and slid another page across. "No, Mr. Sullivan. What you have are partial transitions. The clause requires a continuity signature. Same regulatory officer from pre-approval to close. She was removed mid-cycle." The words landed like a body hitting water. No one breathed. Then the German partner leaned back in his chair and said, very evenly, "This constitutes a compliance breach under your own framework." "Clause 14B, I believe?" Mark stammered. "That clause was, drafted for internal redundancy. It's procedural." The partner's lips barely moved. "Procedural or not, it now invalidates your transaction, effective immediately." You could practically hear Mark's heart stop. He tried to play it cool, calling it a small administrative hiccup, but Reinhardt's team was already packing their folders. "We will need to reassess risk exposure," said one of them. Translation: the deal was dead. I paused the video, sipping my coffee. I'd watched enough boardroom implosions to know the tone of a doomed man. Mark's bluff had failed. The walls were closing in, and every single person in that room now understood the cost of underestimating the quiet compliance director they'd demoted without ceremony. They discovered the 14B filing a few hours later. A junior associate from legal named Priya found it in the outgoing registry while combing through digital archives. The timestamp, 11:42 p.m. The trigger, reassignment of duties, pre-close. The submitter, Aaron Calloway, Regulatory Compliance Officer. Priya had probably thought she'd stumbled onto a clerical error, but as soon as she realized what it meant, that the acquisition was legally frozen for 90 days, she escalated it. By the time the file reached Mark's inbox, it was glowing on his laptop screen like a live grenade. He must have read it twice, maybe 3 times. Then came the inevitable shout. "Who the hell approved this clause?" And someone, probably Martin from legal, would have muttered, "You did." The irony was perfect. They'd all signed off on the clause during last year's audit refresh, the one I'd quietly updated with new regulatory language and pushed through while they were too busy arguing over stock options. They'd given me total autonomy back then because I was the one person who actually read what they signed. That trust had become their noose. By 5 p.m., the board had been notified. The Reinhardt deal, 3 years in the making, was frozen solid. 90 days minimum before they could even apply for reauthorization. And 90 days, in acquisition terms, might as well have been a lifetime. Investors would move. Valuations would rot. Deadlines would cascade. They tried to frame it as a technical delay, even sent out a bland press release about regulatory realignment. But inside the building, everyone knew. Colburn's golden quarter had just flatlined. The thing is, corporate chaos doesn't explode. It spreads. Slowly, quietly, like mold through air vents. And I had the best seat in the city to watch it happen. By the next morning, the silence around Colburn had curdled into rumor. No one could get Reinhardt back on the line, and the acquisition dashboard had been marked pending review in bold red across every internal system. Investors were calling for explanations, analysts were whispering in Slack threads, and HR was temporarily disabling access to staff who might leak details. It didn't matter. The truth had already leaked in the most painful way possible, through absence. Every number that should have been green was gray. Every meeting that should have been celebratory was suddenly rescheduled. You can't spin that. I sat by my window that morning, same coffee mug, same skyline, same building 12 floors below me. Because yes, I'd already accepted a new position. Not just any job, an advisory role with Reinhardt Capital itself. Their partners had reached out discreetly the week before, impressed by my unparalleled knowledge of U.S. compliance frameworks. They didn't know what had happened yet, but they knew enough. When the smoke cleared, they'd want someone who could navigate the wreckage, someone who understood how these traps worked, because she'd built them. From my apartment window, I could see Colburn's main boardroom. The blinds were drawn, but I knew that room's choreography by heart. Mark pacing, legal counsel whispering, someone from PR typing damage control so fast their keyboard smoked. By mid-morning, they had a conference call with Reinhardt scheduled. Internal leaks later showed it lasted 4 minutes. Reinhardt's managing partner spoke precisely 12 words. In light of regulatory uncertainty, we are withdrawing from the acquisition process. And then he hung up. No emotion, no small talk, just surgical finality. When the transcript hit the internal servers, someone, probably a terrified analyst, forwarded it to the wrong group chat. Within an hour, the whole company had seen it. Screenshots spread like wildfire. One line echoed across every hallway, whispered like a curse. Call her back. I don't care what it takes. I didn't answer. By that afternoon, Colburn's communications team tried to spin it. Temporary delay, strategic pause, mutual reassessment of valuation. They even briefed a few friendly journalists. But the financial markets don't care about euphemisms. By market close, Colburn's stock had dropped 8%. It wasn't catastrophic, but it was enough to draw blood, and the press smelled it. Mark tried calling me personally at 8:12 p.m. I let it ring until voicemail. The message he left was desperate but measured, like a man trying to reason with a lit fuse. Aaron, we've had some miscommunications. Perhaps you could consult with us temporarily, help stabilize things. Compensation is flexible. Let's discuss. Translation. We need you to save the deal you killed. I poured another cup of coffee and deleted the voicemail. Because the truth is, they didn't just demote me. They underestimated me. They thought compliance was a backroom function. A box to check, a voice to ignore. They treated my work like wallpaper, invisible until it peeled. But compliance isn't paperwork. It's architecture. And I had built theirs brick by brick. Every clause, every form, every system tied to my name. They'd thought removing me was a personnel decision. It was structural demolition. 2 days later, the board convened what they called an emergency continuity review. 12 people in a glass room, sweating under recessed lighting, while the company's valuation bled out in real time. Every PowerPoint slide still had my original formatting, my color palette, my initials tucked in the footer. "Who authorized her reassignment?" the CEO asked finally. No one answered. The silence stretched until you could hear the HVAC system hum. I wasn't there, but I didn't need to be. My fingerprints were everywhere, in the systems, the workflows, the clauses they'd ignored. And that's the irony of invisibility. When you vanish, people finally see the outline you left behind. Inside that glass-walled boardroom, the air was thick enough to chew. The CEO, Richard Colburn himself, sat slumped at the end of the table, his tie crooked, his usual showman grin replaced by a hollow stare. Around him, 12 executives picked through fragments of a deal that no longer existed. "We need to understand how this happened," he said finally, voice low, like he was afraid the word happened might shatter something fragile. Mark, the CFO, rubbed the bridge of his nose. The clause, 14B, was part of the compliance framework. Aaron built it. We all signed off on it last year. Someone from legal cut in sharply. And none of you thought to review it before restructuring her department? Mark slammed his pen onto the table. It was buried under 12 sub-clauses and cross-references. She tucked it in during the audit refresh. She didn't hide it, legal countered. You approved it. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was punitive. They all stared at the projection on the wall, the PDF of Form 14B, glowing like a ghost. It was 7 pages of dry bureaucratic language, ending with a single line that now read like a death sentence. Mandated reapproval window, 90 days minimum. The CEO exhaled. So we can't close within the quarter? Mark shook his head. Not legally. Reinhardt's window expires in 30 days. They'll walk. And they did, said a voice from the corner. Martin, General Counsel. They sent the formal withdrawal this morning. It hit like a thunderclap. You could almost hear their bonuses evaporating in real time. Mark's face turned the color of old paper. The CEO leaned back, whispering to no one. She warned us. She literally warned us in those risk memos we never read. He wasn't wrong. I had. I'd written a detailed briefing months ago titled Continuity Protocols, Safeguards Against Premature Reassignment. It had gone unread, archived in a shared drive called To Review Later. The irony was biblical. From my new office 2 floors above them, in the very same building, I could see the fallout unfold. Reinhardt's logo was still displayed on the lobby monitor, but their scheduled bookings in Colburn's boardroom had all been canceled. Security badges deactivated, catering orders withdrawn. The golden deal that was supposed to catapult Colburn Dynamics into the global market now sat sealed in a folder marked Regulatory Hold. I didn't feel triumph, exactly. Just stillness. A precise, balanced calm, like watching the end of an equation you'd solved years ago finally play itself out. At 3:00 p.m., Mark tried again. Another voicemail, his voice cracking now. Aaron, I know things were handled poorly. Maybe we can find a temporary consultancy arrangement just to clean up the filings. Help us get back on track. I almost admired the audacity. They'd burned my chair, then asked me to rebuild the floor. I didn't respond. Instead, I forwarded his voicemail to a journalist at Business Current who'd been sniffing around for a story about female executives quietly rewriting corporate power dynamics. I didn't add commentary. The voicemail spoke for itself. The next morning, the article dropped. Compliance Director's Exit Freezes 350 Melmless Acquisition. It didn't name me, but everyone knew. The story spread through LinkedIn like wildfire. Half the comments praised the unsung brilliance of risk management. The other half speculated about internal sabotage. Either way, the message was clear. Don't underestimate the person holding the paperwork. By Friday, HR was in triage mode. They issued a memo about respectful discourse and refraining from sharing sensitive materials externally. It was too late. Investors had already fled. The deal was gone. The stock tanked another 5%. That afternoon, while the board panicked and the PR team drafted apologies, I took the elevator to the 31st floor. Reinhardt Capital's new U.S. office. The same building, better view. My badge scanned green. The receptionist smiled. "Good afternoon, Ms. Calloway. The partners are expecting you." I stepped inside. The carpet was softer, the lighting cooler. Precision, discipline. No slogans on the walls. Just a glass conference room overlooking the skyline I'd once watched through tears. This time, I smiled. The partners from Reinhardt Capital stood as I entered the room. No handshakes of pity, no awkward small talk. Just quiet acknowledgement. These were professionals who understood the difference between vengeance and precision. "Miss Calloway?" said the senior partner, his English crisp but edged with that exacting German cadence. "Thank you for joining us. Your understanding of U.S. regulatory pathways will be invaluable to our next acquisition." His tone didn't flatter. It stated fact. I nodded, taking the seat at the head of the table they'd reserved. Not the guest chair, the lead seat, a statement all its own. They handed me an advisory brief printed on heavy bond paper, my name embossed in the header. I scanned it, already recognizing the structure. Tight, clean, practical. Reinhardt didn't need to be convinced. They simply needed someone who knew where the traps were buried and how to walk through them blindfolded. The meeting lasted under 20 minutes. No posturing, no metaphors, no endless PowerPoints. Just execution. When we finished, the senior partner closed his folder and said, "Welcome aboard." As I rode the elevator down 2 floors to my new office, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the polished steel. Same black blazer, same calm expression, but something fundamental had shifted. I wasn't the invisible fixer anymore. I was the architect. The person you called before you built the system, not after it collapsed. The office itself was minimalist. Matte glass desk, leather chair, a single espresso machine humming in the corner. The windows stretched floor to ceiling, giving a perfect view of the Colburn Dynamics headquarters just below. Through the glass, I could see the movers working under fluorescent lights, hauling boxes stacked like tombstones. Every crate labeled with the same corporate irony, Continuity Archive. One box caught my eye. Sullivan, M. Mark's nameplate peeked out from the top, scratched and bent. I set my espresso on the sill and watched as he crossed the lobby, his phone glued to his ear, his posture smaller than I remembered. Somewhere behind him, HR was probably rehearsing talking points for the inevitable layoffs. PR would soon publish a statement about strategic restructuring and new leadership opportunities. They always did, the polite language of downfall. I didn't feel joy. That's the strange part people never understand about revenge. It isn't fireworks or champagne. It's quiet. It's the stillness of a machine that's finally stopped humming. Watching Colburn crumble wasn't about satisfaction. It was about balance. They made me invisible, so I made myself irreplaceable. They dismissed the fine print, so I became the fine print. Around noon, my phone buzzed. A new email. Subject: Congratulations on your appointment. Internal welcome packet. It was from Reinhardt's operations chief, efficient as ever. Beneath the corporate pleasantries was a single handwritten note scanned into the footer. "We don't hire ghosts. We hire legends." I smiled faintly. It wasn't flattery. It was recognition. That afternoon, I took a slow walk through my new floor. Engineers murmured over spreadsheets in German and English. Analysts debated risk modeling at whiteboards filled with color-coded precision. No chaos, no politics, just competence. Every corner of the office hummed with the energy of people who actually read what they signed. It was, in every sense, home. By 6 p.m., the city below was a grid of soft gold and asphalt shadow. Colburn's once bright logo had been dimmed to half power, the sea flickering like a dying pulse. I watched until the lights went out completely. For the first time in 15 years, I didn't feel like I was waiting for the next blow. The system I'd built had spoken for me. It had rendered judgment in my absence. I closed my laptop, leaned back in the chair, and let the silence stretch. The skyline hadn't changed. The same river, the same glass towers, the same traffic crawling through downtown. But the view was different. The view was mine now.